Nagraj, you made some self-deprecating comments there about venture capitalists and them being self-serving and so forth. And I think what might be true is that 99% of VCs give the other 1% of us a bad name. But now I'm going to introduce Kevin Bloch, who is well known as Cisco's Chief Technology Officer in the region and is also responsible for innovation investments and VC, as well as the innovation centres in Sydney and Perth. Kevin's going to introduce a panel discussion with leading multinationals that have a presence in Israel. Please welcome Kev.
Good morning, and thanks again, Etty, for putting this on. It's terrific. I want to set a bit of context to myself first and then ask the panel to come up. So I've been here for about 30 years. The first half of my career was R&D in this country. And then I flipped over to Cisco. I've been CTO for 10 years. And Cisco's got a very interesting story to tell globally from an acquisition and innovation investment perspective. Having bought about 194 companies, that's about one every 6 weeks. We've invested in about 11 in Israel to, I think it's about $15 billion. The last one was a few months ago, which interestingly enough was Liba, which is a hardware company, and I think Liba in Hebrew means core. Is that correct? So investing in hardware because with respect to Microsoft and Mark Andreessen, a lot of the software still got to run on stuff, and some of the stuff still needs to be developed. So that's a little bit about Cisco. We very much, based on what's going on around the world, realize that we can't do it on our own with our own 25,000 engineers. And hence we are opening innovation centres around the world, including in Australia. And in particular in Australia, what we're focusing in on is agri-tech, mining, smart cities transport, as well as astronomy. And we can talk about why later on. So that's enough about me. This is a very important topic, innovation, both in enterprise and in country. And I think we've got a lot to learn from our panel. Would the panel please step up and join me? Thank you. So while the panel's taking their seats, the structure we're going to use in order to get the conversation going. Ayala over here. Okay, and I think you can see the names should be in right order, correct? Okay. What we're going to do is really break it up into three parts. I'm going to get the panel to introduce themselves. I'm sure they'll do a much better and much more briefer job than I would ever. Then we're going to talk about innovation in enterprise, and then talk about it from a country, and in particular Israel and Australia perspective. So with that, we've got an amazing panel here representing really a very good cross-section, both, actually it's quite interesting, country, company, as well as gender-wise as well. It's not that common, certainly from a technology point of view in Australia. So Ayala, Telstra. Tell us a little bit, Telstra's been around for a long time, and all of us in Australia would have known Telstra from the days of even when it was the PNG, not really known for innovation, then getting transformed, a lot of competition coming into the country, and in the last 5 years we've seen some tremendous changes going on in Telstra. Give us some insight into why and what's happening there.
Sure, so first of all it's Ayala, but for the Israelis in the audience, it is Ayala. So I am originally from Israel, came to Australia from working for a number of startups in Israel and around the world before joining Telstra. It's about 13 years ago, and I can tell you that it's a completely different Telstra 13 years ago and now. And Telstra is doing a lot when it comes to innovation. But before we go there, innovation is such a overused term. It's a buzzword that means a lot of things to a lot of people. And a lot of people confusing innovation with the act of generating ideas, thinking that if we generate ideas, then it's innovation. But in fact, it requires It's only if you implement and exploit the ideas that you get the business benefit.
Okay, I'm going to stop you because I made a mistake. I wanted you to do just a quick introduction. It was my fault. Quick introduction, we'll just go through and then we'll come back to you. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. So, I've started the introduction just by saying that I started my career in Israel in the startup ecosystem, came to Australia, did a number of roles in product management, product marketing, around mobiles, business applications, then cloud. And now I lead the innovation function at the Telstra Chief Technology Office.
Brilliant. With your boss sitting somewhere in the audience, right?
Yes.
Okay, Nagraj.
I'm going to give some time back to the panel because I already spoke so much. So
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Zippy.
Tzipi. So thank you. I've got 20 years experience in retail and recently moved to AMP in financial services. Moved to Australia 11 years ago from Israel, and where I was in Tivtam, the most innovative retail company in Israel. What we were able to do was very interesting to a lot of companies, retail companies from all over the world, which they came and see us. And the one thing I do remember, and I can talk from my experience, is the CEO of the company told me, "You're the CEO, these are the keys," which goes to Dov discussions before. And he said, "These are the keys, just manage your team, create a team culture and innovate." And what we were able to do in 3 or 4 years with 8 people was discussed in a lot of retail companies all over the world.
Okay, thanks very much, Ajoy.
The 2 parts of my career that are relevant to this panel. I founded and built the corporate innovation arm of Tata Consulting, a small company in India. And it involved everything from partnering with startups to investing in startups to all sorts of things, because it's a conglomerate. We went across verticals. Israel was a very key component of that because we ended up partnering with academia, with startups, with private equity firms, with various innovation entities in Israel. So that's the relevance of Tata. And today I'm the founding partner of a venture fund called Follow the Seed. 2 of my partners are Israeli. One of them is based in Israel. One of them is based in Australia. I myself, I'm from the Valley. I've been in the Valley for donkey's years.
Terrific, thanks. And Hadas.
Thank you. I'm Hadas. Pleasure to meet you all. I'm from the Israel Innovation Authority, which you might know and be more familiar with, the Office of the Chief Scientist of the Ministry of Economy. It was recently renamed, among other changes. And so basically we're a government entity that promotes technological innovation, research and development in Israel. We provide funding. It's one of our core activities. And we also have a range of other programs supporting companies at all different stages of the life cycle. I specifically look at Asia Pacific. We have cooperation programs in place to encourage partnerships. And we also have several programs in place for multinational companies. So I'm very happy here today to talk a little bit about the role of multinationals in Israel and how we see them contributing to the local ecosystem.
Excellent. So now we will come back to you, Ayala, and I do apologise. Going back to Telstra, there's been a lot of changes. I think some very obvious to people in terms of venture capital, Muradi, as well as what's underneath the surface. Do you want to talk to us about that?
Yeah, so just picking up, I've started before, I mean, it's about how you execute, how you experiment and execute on the ideas that create the innovation. And there's no one-size-fits-all, magic solution for that. It requires collaboration. It requires investment. So if we think about collaboration, it's collaboration with strategic partners. It's collaboration with startups, with universities, research. If you think about investment, it's investment that we all know in companies, but it's also investment in people, investment in entrepreneurs, in high school kids, in students, and it's also investment in technology and new ways of working and methodologies. So, you've mentioned, so Telstra is obviously very active in all of those areas, and some examples do include, Muradi, Telstra Ventures.
So can you I think some people may not know what Muradi is.
So that is Telstra-backed startup accelerator. Yeah, so it runs in Sydney, in Singapore, and in partnerships around the world.
And what is it, a venture capital fund? What does it do?
Yeah, so
From a startup, how
I
do you
won't
help them?
steal Annie's thunder because Annie's on another panel tomorrow, so I'll let Annie talk a little bit more about Muradi at length. But it's a fantastic program, and I would say it's one of the leading in Australia.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Tzipi, because just following from the Telstra to the AMP brand, you may want to just explain who AMP is, what it does. But in particular, I'd like to hear from you what programs, what initiatives does AMP have to foster innovation?
Yeah, and I think a lot of corporates building on what Ayala said, it's very important to make the complex simple and to try and simplify the opportunities and the customers' challenges that we might have. And with AMP being an insurance, bank and wealth management company, one of the areas where we've started about a year ago is to do a day of innovation, which we call Push IT. And it's again a new way of working. We've got all the teams coming together, looking at NPS, which is where the customers are telling us our problems, and they finding the problem that they want to work on, and they're working together as a team in a very fun environment, and they are able to innovate, propose ideas, and just create whatever they would like to.
So if there's a good idea on the day, how does one take that forward and make it happen? Because ideas are kind of cheap.
Yeah.
It's making them happen that's the hard part. How does AMP?
So again, we're trying to cut it to small kind of ideas. So as an example, we were looking at about 200 different problems, 70 of them being implemented already. Okay. We've got about 10% that we know that will take us more time to go and to discuss. But I think it's more about the team that coming together that day with the business, with the IT, and everyone looking at different ways to actually solve the problem. And it's working.
And is this internal?
It's internal.
Or is it with external
It's internal,
companies?
but we have invited some of our vendors to participate.
Right.
And they're bringing a lot of, ideas, but a lot of opportunities for us to solve them.
Yeah, because I think this is the big change in the last 5-10 years, where big corporate brands are realising, to externalise some of these initiatives. Maybe Nagraj, you, in Microsoft, actually you were with Qualcomm before, right?
Yeah.
In both those companies, again, big brands. Can you tell us a little bit about inside? How is Microsoft innovating? Also, like, AMP, Telstra, big brands, how do you, maintain that sort of spark?
I think being in now 2 big companies, it is an incredibly hard job to sort of innovate outside in. I mean, I think everybody in their day job is innovating. I mean, otherwise the companies wouldn't exist. Qualcomm is now a $100 billion market cap company. Microsoft is $450 billion. So that is sort of a day job of innovating. It's what is required, and why many corporates are turning to venture capital groups is to see what other ideas are there that they can bring from the outside. And I think that is a challenge which I don't think there's a secret bullet to it. It's actually quite hard to do. You always have somebody inside the company saying, I can do it. And I think the way I approach it is, generally speaking, when I'm looking at startups, I will look to see if it passes my filter. And then when I go back to the product groups, while I don't need I've never in Qualcomm and in Microsoft, the way we have structured the venture capital program is the product groups cannot veto it. But I still will ask, is this something that you are working on? And the answer I always get is yes, of course. And I say, okay, when are you working on it? Well, it's on the roadmap. Then you keep digging. I say, when is it in the roadmap? Is it funded today with people sitting in the seats? And they say, no, it's 12 months. I said, well, if it's 12 months, you're much better off partnering with a hungry startup, because they have only one objective in life, and they live or die by that. You have 100 things to do, and the fact that you don't have this funded today means it's 99th on your priority list. And so that conversation is very delicate, but you have to keep having that. If you keep having that, that brings in the outside-in thinking. But to be fair, everybody in these big companies is still innovating, and that's why these companies exist and survive and do well. It's just that can you make sure you survive transitions? And I think if you look at what Microsoft has done is a really great job of sort of getting past the business that we were in to sort of the cloud business, and that transition is what it sort of marks companies that survive one era or the other. And the more outside-in thinking you're able to bring in, the better it is. So I think it's a daily challenge, but as long as there are people who are committed to doing that, I think you can break the barriers down with the product groups.
Thank you. Ajoy. You've had quite a varied background, and you would have pivoted quite a few times personally, right? Now, it's kind of interesting. Do you, in your, and I think the example of Israel pivoting, I think India is pivoting. I think Australia's trying to pivot, probably a little bit too slowly. Companies are trying to pivot. What do you see happening in companies? Do you think they're able? Do you think the Telstras, the Ciscos, Microsofts can do it? Or do you think you've got to sort of break them apart?
No, I don't think you have to break them apart. My experience, going back to what Nagraj was saying, is actually been completely on the external side, because Tata's being a system integrator, It was all about providing innovation to our clients. So it was about understanding what clients across different business verticals required, and then going and partnering with Israel and Silicon Valley, Boston, India, China, even Brazil, for crying out loud, and building the solutions that were required by the clients. So in fact, compared to my colleagues here, my complete perspective has been how to bring outside innovation and put a wrapper around it in terms of a Tata, call it some solution, and then sell it to a Walmart or a Bank of America or whatever have you. Now, in terms of pivot, it depends from place to place. And I mentioned Brazil with a little bit of sarcasm because Brazil is extremely local. So even I tried to do several innovation forums in Brazil, and I'll come back to how it ties into Australia. And the big banks, Santander, and all of the big clients in Brazil only wanted to work with Brazilian startups, even though you had really disruptive companies from the Bay Area that I bought for them to have a look at. They only wanted to work with Brazilian startups that were 5, 6, 7 years behind. But that was, so my answer to your question is it really depends. And I have not seen that in Australia. I haven't seen Australian big companies like Telstra and say that we only want to work with Australian startups. In fact, the only reason we are here is because they're working with Israeli startups. So I think that is not an issue here at all.
It's starting to change.
Yep.
So Hadas, in Israel, there's been a lot of changes, and we kind of look up to Israel in terms of how it's really embraced this next generation of digital transformation. And the government seems to have got that quite a long time ago. How do you feel? Do you think that Israel's sort of on top of the world? Do you think that there's more that you can do? Or how well? What's your scorecard on Israel having pivoted?
Well, I definitely think we're on top of the world. Certainly in terms of technological innovation, being the startup nation, there's a reason that we've been dubbed in that way. You see incredible achievements, multinationals that are present in Israel. It's not just that they're active there, but some of their core products and flagship products are coming from Israeli engineers and Israeli R&D centers. And that's something that I don't think can be overlooked. And we've discussed the numbers. There's more than 300 MNCs active in Israel. And 300 MNCs I don't think can be wrong. There's a reason that they're there. But it is very important, and that's certainly something that the government and the Israel Innovation Authority is looking at, is how to adjust, how to be dynamic, how to address the changing needs. So we certainly are keen on pivoting. That's actually why we have a new name, and it's more than just a new name. We're trying to adjust and address different market needs. In general, the role of the government is always to see where are the market failures, what can we do to help solve them. We don't want to replace the private sector, we want to complement the private sector. So right now, and I think I should mention actually, we're talking about different industry sectors that are kind of trendy or popular and where we're leading. In general, the government is pretty unbiased when it comes to industry sector. We're very open, we have a bottom-up approach, and we let the industry decide what is the next trend, what is the next hot topic. There are certain fields that require a little bit more intervention and a little bit more support. Life sciences, for example. So we do provide certain incentives and programs for those sectors. But our general funding, I mean, it depends on where the demand is coming. And I think that that approach is something that you won't see in a lot of different governments and a lot of different countries. But it's something that we're all about, adjusting and demand and addressing the needs that are coming from the market. So I think that we're doing a pretty good job with that.
I'm going to come back to that,
Yeah.
but I'm going to ask Ayala and Tzipi in particular from an Australian perspective. What do you think's happening? Where are we at as a country in terms of really innovating and encouraging both startups as well as multinationals?
I think it's definitely progressed in the past 3 to 5 years.
Yep.
You definitely see much more interest, and I think everyone's talking about kind of the culture and some of the opportunities or areas we can learn from Israel around risk-taking and ability to learn from mistake and to be open and to allow these mistakes to happen in kind of what we do. So I definitely see a huge
So it's changing.
a
Do you
huge
see the
change.
same here?
Yeah, and look, I think there's amazing innovation in Australia. We just talked about it before. We probably need to talk about it more, but I think there's definitely amazing innovation. But just to touch on what Hadas said, I think what will be really interesting to explore further is the relationship between the government, the academia, the corporates, and how we can do things even better at an ecosystem at a more strategic level. So yeah, that will be something that I personally will be keen to explore more, how we can really take it to the next level in Australia.
Okay. Nagraj,
I'm just going to add, so I arrived yesterday from the States, and yesterday I spent with, I think, a total of 3 or 4 really, really interesting Australian startups. So I can also see that not only is some of the local funding going on that is more than when I've come here in the past. The other thing I did ask a few of the folks was, what have you seen? Why are your customers in Australia being more innovative or being more open to taking on your solution? Has anything fundamentally changed? And why couldn't you have done this 3 years back? One of the answers that came up, and I think this is a global phenomenon, but they said a lot of the regulated industries in Australia, now that they're open to figuring out that they can move their data into the cloud, that has enabled them to try new things out at a much faster pace than before. And I think so, taking advantage of a macro trend. So one of the things that I think Australia did well was to insist that the data doesn't leave the country, which means that the multinationals had to invest in data center, and cloud providers had to actually invest in country. And now that that is there, the big Australian corporations are going to be more comfortable having the data moved from on-prem to cloud, which will actually then spur a lot more innovation that Australian startups can sort of find product market fit here, go global more faster. So I think while it's a macro trend, it's actually fairly interesting that 2 of the, I think the 3 or 4 companies I met touched upon this as one of the reasons they did it. They can do it now, and they couldn't have done it 3 years back.
And just because I think you cover the world in terms of where does Australia fit? If you had to sort of give us a high or low rating in terms of innovation and where we're at in the journey.
I think it is clearly starting out. As I said, what I don't have a good feel for today is what is Australia really, really good at. I mean, there's big billion-dollar companies now being formed with Atlassian and a few others. I mean, this Canva is doing great. So that is happening, but it is not completely clear as to what do I come here for specifically. I don't have that view yet. I think once that is developed, then I think you'll see a lot more companies and venture capitalists come, because if it is yet another SaaS company, it's fine. There's nothing wrong with it, but I can also find that somewhere else. But one of the hardest discussions we have in our group, and I actually had in Qualcomm when we were looking at a company, was with my Israeli colleagues, because they were like adamant, security company, it's just the best in Israel. I mean that, and it's while we won some arguments, we lost some, mostly lost to Israelis. But it is not clear that argument I can have today. So I think the journey is much better than what I've seen over the last 2 years. but I think you have to sort of almost have a distinct identity. And I think there's the Office of Chief Scientist was referred, and that I think was a critical part in getting that going. Now, being blunt, there were some issues with how that program was run. The good news with the program was there. There was some disadvantage. I think the changes they're making in Israel actually will make it even more effective at this point.
Okay.
So I think there's some active government intervention would be great.
I'm going to get to Hadas, but Ajoy, I just want to ask from your point of view, when you look at, I mean, you've got your investment, I think you said in 3 different countries in the world. 4. Yeah. You would have had a bit of a scan in terms of relativity. What's your perspective of where Australia is, vis-a-vis Israel and any other place that...
Well, first of all, I mean, our fund is in 4 countries, but during my days at Tata and Cognizant, we were global. So I'd even gone to New Zealand to look at deal flow for. But with Nagraj, it's exactly what I feel. I mean, if I think cyber security, I think Israel. If I think smart city initiatives, I think Israel. If I think anything around water, I think Israel. There's nothing like that sticks to Australia yet. Like, what is it that sticks? That we must go and look at Australia, right? That's and the other thing I think on the speed of execution, I think the Australian startups, their speed of execution still needs a little bit more of evolution if you compare.
Is that a funding issue?
No, it's just mindset issue. You send entrepreneurs from here to Silicon Valley and they come back and say, oh my God, I could have got this done 2 months quicker.
Yeah, I mean, our perspective, Cisco's perspective, when I look at what's going on here and other countries, we're still seeing startups thinking small, period. Yeah. When you deal with Israeli startups, Silicon Valley, it's $1 billion start. Yeah. We're looking for a really big market. We don't have, I think, enough of that mentality in Australia yet. It's going to get there, but it's not there yet.
But we're working at the moment with a startup, a Stone and Chalk startup, that's founded in Australia 3 years ago, and they weren't able to find any customers. They went to the US. They have 8 customers, and then 3 years later, now they got back to Australia, and now a lot of companies are talking to them. But again, I think it's part of that change that's happening, and they, again, thinking a bit bigger. And
I think the thinking bigger, by the way, fundamentally, we see a little bit of that in European countries also. It's not necessarily the startup's problem. It's the problem of the local VC ecosystem. Yeah. If I don't know that I can get my next round of funding, then I will think small. Yeah. And that is fundamentally it. Once you take that shackle away, and the reason Israeli companies don't have that issue is there's a well-established Israel Silicon Valley model. You raise your Series A or seed money, and then you go to the Valley and you're going to get money, or you have got many US VCs in Israel. If you don't have to overthink where your next round is coming from, then you can think big. If you're always constrained by whether I'm going to get my next round and the VCs are telling me, go to cash flow break even, actually a lot of times VCs will tell you. That's, I think, the fundamental. And
that relates back to your point, Ajoy. It's about that speed, you know. And the speed, by the way, and this is where the multinational comes in, I think. My own personal experience in Australia with Australian R&D is you do it all yourself. Your head's down, and while your head's down, the world's moving. The market's moving. And if you don't have eyeballs around the world, then you might miss the whole thing.
Yeah, and in Silicon Valley, everybody's moving so fast that if you execute anywhere off the rails, you just fall off. Right. You can't afford the luxury of taking more time than you need to because there's just too much. It's the same, here you have that luxury. Yeah. You could take too much time, which is what my colleagues are saying in terms of, thinking. You could think small or average, and you could get away with it for a couple of months without knowing that you're actually falling behind.
Hadas, I really want to hear from you in what was the Office of Chief Scientist, because there's a big difference to what we do here. And clearly what you've done, I'm sure there are always things you could have done better, but you've done a lot right. You've plugged what we politically call market defects, and you've really fostered an environment of a cultural environment, as well as all the other things. We talked about how do you bring research into it. Talk to us about what you're doing right from what was called the Office of Chief Scientist.
I didn't realize it's politically incorrect to say market failures. Is that the... is it
we call it market defects.
Okay, just checking.
I'm not a politician.
I did grow up in the States,
want.
But sometimes I do have the Israeli bluntness that maybe I shouldn't be having. No, I think that, first of all, some interesting things I think have come up. I think that Israeli companies, to a certain extent, think big and think globally, and that's the moment that they're born, because we don't have a local market. I mean, it's a default approach. And part of that is why the MNCs are so important and why cooperation is so important. We don't believe that an Israeli company can do everything themselves. As much as we're discussing how amazing and innovative Israel is, we know that innovation exists all over the world, in Australia as well, and that's why we have cooperative programs. That's why we fund bilateral cooperation between Israeli and Australian companies. By the way, we have a program with New South Wales that we just signed an agreement for this year. So in general, I mean, the government, I think, does play a very critical role. I think we've seen that over the years of the chief scientist's existence. We're talking about, why there's such a concentrated existence of amazing startups in Israel and a VC industry. In the 90s, the Office of the Chief Scientist basically supported the development of the VC industry in Israel through a program called Yotzma. After that program kind of took on its own life and the VC industry became alive without our support, we took a step back. We no longer needed to be there. And that's something that isn't always so easy for governments, I think, to do. To say, okay, we're done with this program, we're done with this initiative, we're gonna take a step back, we're gonna look at what is the next challenge. And then we saw, populations coming in from the Soviet Union, jobs were needing to be created for these highly skilled people. The incubator program was created. And I think the incubator program is actually really interesting in the sense that it's really a public-private partnership. We see multinationals coming in as shareholders in these incubators. It's through a license from the Office of the Chief Scientist. We fund up to 85% of the R&D expenses for the incubated company. I mean, that's huge. But we're not talking about a lot of money. We're talking about a little bit of money that's needed at the very early stages to help companies get to the next stage. And then the incubator managers provide the mentoring and legal support. They provide the other 15%. So this is just an example of a program that we implement to try to leverage the private sector interest and investment in R&D to enable companies to reach the market that might not otherwise have gotten there.
Did this call on the either chief scientist or innovation authority, whatever it's called?
Yeah, sorry.
Did you have to? I realize there's other sort of requirements, but from a technology point of view,
yeah.
We've been talking about what, for example, would Australia stand for? Why would you invest, right? From a technology point of view, did you have to pick winners? From a technology point of view?
We do pick winners, but we evaluate companies. We have a very, professional, I believe, evaluation process. And, at the end of the day, not every company receives funding from our office. You do have to go through a process. But I think that one of the big differences is how we rank projects. We are not afraid of risky projects. And that's something that allows... In fact, we celebrate risky projects because we know that those are the ones that have the potential to be very disruptive and very groundbreaking. And if we don't get our money back, it's okay. By the way, we give conditional grants. So if a project is successful and results in sales, we get the money back. But if not, we don't get the money back. And we're not afraid of that. It's okay. There's buy-in from the public as well on that. And I think that is a really crucial element that I haven't seen everywhere around the world.
Okay, Nagraj, I just want to ask you, as we're sort of nearing towards the end, how do you see that panning out, again, across multiple countries? Are you seeing the influence of, the chief scientists and what they've done, and the lack of it maybe in other countries?
Yeah, I haven't actually seen a good comparable model. The one exception that I think is moving towards our model is Ireland. And Ireland, just from a population perspective and the remoteness perspective, is sort of similar to Israel. And there, the government is getting involved, similar to the OCS. They actually have gotten a vehicle which essentially is a sovereign wealth fund. But the primary goal of the sovereign wealth fund is to only invest in companies in Ireland that can create a leveraged amount of jobs. So that is actually one of the more interesting models I've seen from smaller countries that want to make an impact. They're also doing a very similar model of sending delegations on a very regular basis to the US, hosting delegations from the US into Ireland, promoting the culture for Irish startups. So I think that's probably the closest I've seen to coming where we follow the Israeli model. And actually, they're seeing a lot of success. They're actually seeing a fair bit of success, specifically as they've directed this wealth fund to only invest in companies that can generate jobs. The one thing they're doing, which is very interesting, is they're also figuring out what is unique about Ireland. And they are coming up with a couple of areas that are very, very unique given Ireland's position, and trying to fund a lot more of that.
Okay. So look, we're going to have to wrap up. I think we've got a lot out of today in terms of speed, in terms of the influence of government and the chief scientists for a global perspective, some big brands as well. I'd like you to all join me in thanking the panelists for a terrific session. I think we can. Thanks very much.